So there are 4 mechanisms that can give rise to evolution. You can see here in this picture, hopefully you can spot him. This little mouse has undergone evolution in order to help hide it from the owl. Unfortunately, in this case, I don't think that mouse probably got that lucky. I think the owl probably got lunch. So we're going to discuss those 4 agents of evolutionary change, the 4 mechanisms. So here I've just got them written out, and then we're going to go through each of them in detail. So we're going to look at mutation, genetic drift, migration, and natural selection. Some of these have more to them than others, so some of them are very easy and straightforward, and some of them are a little more complicated. So we'll spend some more time on some of them. Now, just remember from earlier on, evolution is genetic change in a population. So we're looking at changes of the whole population. So it's not enough for the change to happen in just one individual. It has to happen in multiple individuals in order for evolution to happen. All right, so we're going to start off with mutation. So mutation is a direct change in the DNA of an individual. So I know we haven't talked about it yet. You may or may not know what DNA is. So DNA is a molecule that is used to store our genetic information. It's used to store our directions. So if a change is made to that DNA, to the directions, it can change the organism, right? And this is the ultimate source of genetic variation, because the only way to really get genetic variation is to change the directions. And so for the other 3 mechanisms we're going to talk about to work, ultimately they have to have mutation occur at some point. Okay? So we're going to have direct change to the DNA of an individual. Now we're going to see not all changes, not all mutations lead to evolution. So there are some kind of requirements for mutation to lead to evolution. So again, mutation, it's the alteration of an individual's DNA, so that genetic information, but it's not enough to just alter the DNA. So in our DNA, there are sections that we call genes. You may have heard of that term before. Genes are just sections of the DNA with specific directions. So this is basically like our cookbook. So it's going to tell your body to make the protein to make the color of your eyes, or the proteins to make the hair color, you know, your skin pigments, that sort of thing. So these are the recipes to make you. So in all of the DNA information, you have specific recipes that are what we call genes. We'll talk more in detail about these later in the semester. So when the alteration happens in a gene, so if the change, the mutation happens in a gene, that's when it may change the characteristic in an organism. So a mutation in the DNA isn't enough. The mutation has to happen in a gene. All right. So in order for it to create evolution, the first part is it has to happen in a gene, because we have to actually change the directions for something that's being made in the organism. So that's step 1, basically, for mutation for evolution. So we need to have the mutation happen in a gene to change the characteristic. And you'll see it may change it. Depending on how it changes the directions, it might not make any change in that characteristic. The second part is where the change happens. Okay? So our we as organisms are made up of two different types of cells. So we are made up of somatic cells, or what would be called body cells. And then we also have reproductive cells. And reproductive cells would be things like sperm and eggs. Okay. So which of these somatic cells or reproductive cells are the cells that get passed on to offspring? So which are inherited by offspring? Hopefully you said reproductive cells. So our eggs and sperm are the ones that are passed on. So we know that the mutations have to happen in the genes, but what kind of cells do the mutations have to occur in for evolution then to happen? Because remember, evolution has to happen in offspring in order to change the population. So they have to happen in reproductive cells. So mutation, in order to create evolution, has to happen in the genes of reproductive cells. So it has to happen in the genes of egg cells or sperm cells in order to create evolution. If it happens, for example, in a skin cell on your hand, it's not going to make any difference to your offspring because they're not going to inherit that skin cell on your hand. Okay. All right, so what causes mutations? So go ahead and answer that question. And there's lots of things that could cause mutations. One that a lot of people don't know or think about is that just dividing cells can create a mutation. So when we talk later in the semester about cell division, you're actually going to see there are ways that we can cause errors. Well, not cause errors, but errors can occur when we divide cells to make new cells. So the process of copying DNA to make new cells and then actually dividing it up can create problems. A lot of environmental phenomena can create it. So my guess is this is what a lot of you probably put in. So things like UV radiation, chemicals from things like cigarettes and pesticides, X-rays. There are lots and lots of different materials that can create mutations because the materials that they are made out of are going to change the DNA in our cells. So then the last question is, are mutations beneficial or detrimental? Because mutations are random. They don't care where they happen. And the answer is, it depends. It depends on where those mutations happen in the gene and how they change the gene. So if the change happens to make a characteristic a little better for an organism, then they'd be beneficial. If it makes it so, the organism isn't as good at surviving and reproducing, maybe it makes it more difficult for them to run, then that could be detrimental. So it really depends on what that mutation is as far as what would be as far as beneficial or detrimental. So, tanning beds bombard the body with UV radiation. Can they cause mutations? All right. Next thing to take a look at as far as mutations go is fitness. So, fitness is a measure of reproductive success compared to others of your same species. So, for example, we're looking at frogs here, so we're going to compare these two different frogs as far as their fitness goes. So yeah, it's not like exercise fitness, this is reproductive fitness. And the question is, can mutation affect your fitness? So this goes back to the beneficial versus detrimental for mutations. Well, if we take a look, here's the DNA, Here's the normal DNA sequence for the gene. Here is the mutated. So something has mutated the DNA sequence. This DNA sequence is coding for a protein, so it's a building block, and the mutation actually has changed it. It's mutated the protein, and in this case, that protein is involved with coding for limbs. Might be a little hard to see, but if you look pretty closely, you should be able to see 2 extra legs. There's 3 legs here, and 2 of them are these little guys. Now, would this make it harder for that frog to survive and reproduce, or easier for it to survive and reproduce? And I will give you a hint, if you take a look versus the other leg over here, these 2 little legs are not muscular. So they don't have muscles in them to help the frog jump. So yeah, these legs are not going to help. So this is probably going to reduce the fitness, reduce their reproductive success. In fact, nearly all mutations reduce an organism's fitness. So let's think about it this way. You've written a 10-page paper, and I'm sure you've all written a 10-page research paper or writing paper. Now, imagine you have that paper and you flip it to a random page, and then you take your pen and randomly select a letter on the page and change it to a different letter. Is that change likely to make your paper better or worse? Yeah, it's going to make your paper generally worse because you're likely going to make it into a word that's not a word. You're going to spell it wrong, right? And so this is why nearly all mutations are going to reduce an organism's fitness, right? Now the thing is that we actually have ways to correct errors in our DNA. So mutations are actually very, very rare in organisms. They still show up, but we do have ways to fix them. But we need mutations because they are the ultimate source of genetic variation in populations to actually create the other 3 ways that we're going to get evolution that I will talk about in future videos.